Marcus had flown through sandstorms, forest fires, and midnight rescues over black ocean waters, but nothing in 20 years of piloting had prepared him for the call that came through his radio that morning. A trembling voice from a military dispatcher describing instruments going dark, compasses spinning backward, and pilots refusing to enter. Airspace over a canyon where the sky itself seemed to be breaking the laws of physics. He took the job not because he was fearless, but because something in the description pulled at a place deeper than logic, a magnetic tug in his chest that felt less like curiosity and more like destiny, calling his name through static and distance. The coordinates led him toward a forgotten stretch of desert where ancient rock walls rose like the ribs of a sleeping god, and as his helicopter crossed into the restricted zone, every gauge on his dashboard began to flicker and die, one by one, as if invisible hands were gently switching off the modern world. His altimeter spun uselessly, his radio hissed into silence, and his GPS dissolved into meaningless numbers. Yet the helicopter continued to fly, suspended by something beyond fuel and mechanics, carried forward by an intention that was not his own. Marcus felt his breath catch as a fog rolled up from the canyon floor, not the natural mist of morning, but a luminescence that seemed woven from moonlight and electric charge, thick and aware, parting before his cockpit like a curtain drawn aside by an unseen stagehand. His hands tightened on the controls, though he was no longer controlling anything, only witnessing as he descended through layers of light that shifted from silver to gold to a blue, so deep it felt like falling through the heart of a hymn. When the fog finally cleared and the canyon floor rose to meet him, Marcus saw something that shattered every framework his mind had built to explain the universe. A being, colossal and radiant, standing beside a structure that pulsed with geometric perfection and ancient purpose, its crystalline surfaces covered in symbols that seemed to breathe and shift like living language. The giant was at least 30 feet tall, its form humanoid but elongated, wrapped in what appeared to be robes made of starlight itself, cascading down in folds that shimmered between solid and translucent, as if woven from the fabric that holds galaxies together. Its skin, if it could be called skin, glowed with a soft phosphorescence, a luminosity that did not cast shadows, but instead seemed to banish darkness from existence, filling the canyon with a presence that felt older than stone, wiser than time, and impossibly gentle despite its overwhelming scale. Marcus hovered there, suspended between earth and sky, his helicopter somehow stable in defiance of every failing instrument, and as the being slowly turned its gaze toward him, he felt his soul recognize something it had forgotten, a memory written in light before flesh, before birth, before the first word was ever spoken into the void. The eyes that met his were not human, yet they held within them such oceans of compassion, and knowing that tears spilled down Marcus's face without permission, without shame, only gratitude for being seen, truly seen, by something that understood not just who he was, but who he had always been meant to become. And then the voice came, not through his ears, but through every cell of his body simultaneously, a telepathic whisper that resonated in his bones and blood, gentle as a father's hand on a frightened child's shoulder, saying without words that it had been waiting here, in this exact moment, for a witness to arrive, for a heart open enough to carry what was about to be revealed. The being raised one luminous hand toward the crystalline device, and the air around it began to hum with a frequency that Marcus could taste and feel and hear all at once, a vibration that seemed to be the foundational note upon which all creation was composed. The device responded instantly, its surfaces igniting with cascading symbols that poured down its faces like liquid light, mathematical and mystical, merging science and sacredness into a language that transcended both. Marcus watched in breathless awe as the device pulsed brighter, brighter still, until the very sky above the canyon began to fracture, not violently, but beautifully, like ice cracking under spring sun, revealing not emptiness beyond, but layers of reality that had always been there, hidden just beyond the veil of ordinary sight. The heavens split open in a blossoming wound of color and dimension, and from that opening poured a holographic projection so vast and intricate that it wrapped around the entire canyon, turning stone walls into screens displaying the secret history of the world. Marcus saw civilizations rising from dust, golden, ages glowing with wisdom, great temples aligned to stars that sang instructions to those who knew how to listen, and moving among them all, guiding, teaching, protecting, figures of light who walked as both flesh and spirit, bridges between the mud of earth and the fire of heaven. He saw humanity not as alone, not as abandoned, but as tended across millennia by intelligences whose love was patient enough to wait through centuries of forgetting, whose hope was strong enough to believe that one day the children of Earth would remember who they truly were. The projection shifted and focused, time accelerating through empires and exiles, through prophets and kings, through waiting and longing, until it arrived at a specific place, a specific moment, Jerusalem bathed in the amber light of a sun that had witnessed everything and forgotten nothing. And there, moving through narrow streets crowded with humanity's hopes and fears, Marcus saw him, Jesus, the name that had been whispered in prayers and sung in cathedrals, the figure who had divided history itself, walking among the people with an aura of light identical to the radiance emanating from the giant being standing beside Marcus now. The Saviour's face was filled with such tender compassion that Marcus felt his heart break open with recognition, and surrounding that beloved form was a luminescence that pulsed in perfect harmony with the alien's own glow, a frequency of love so pure it transcended species, planets, and the boundaries between physical and divine. The giant's voice returned to Marcus's mind, reverent and clear, explaining that Jesus was not diminished by this cosmic connection, but magnified, fully human, yes, but also fully aligned with the universal source that binds all consciousness together, the divine frequency that religions call God and scientists call the unified field, but which is ultimately just love in its most concentrated, intentional, world-altering form. Marcus understood in that moment that the incarnation was even more miraculous than tradition had taught, not God pretending to be human, but God showing humanity what they could become when flesh fully surrendered to the indwelling light, when a human heart became so transparent to divine love that it could hold and transmit the healing frequency that connects every living soul across infinite space. Marcus felt his knees weaken, even though he remained seated in the cockpit, his entire body trembling with the recognition that he was standing spiritually, if not physically, on holy ground, in the presence of something that carried within it the echo of the divine voice that once spoke worlds into existence. The giant being remained still, its luminous form radiating patience that felt eternal, and Marcus realized with sudden clarity that this creature was not merely alien in the sense of foreign or other, but alien in the way that angels must have seemed to shepherds in ancient fields, terrifying in scale, yet utterly benevolent in essence, a messenger carrying truths too vast for human language, yet simple enough for a willing heart to receive. He wanted to speak, to ask the 1,000 questions that cascaded through his mind like water through broken dam walls, but his voice caught in his throat, trapped between awe and unworthiness, between desperate need to understand and fear that understanding might shatter what remained of his small, carefully constructed reality. The being seemed to sense his struggle, and the telepathic presence in his mind grew warmer, softer, wrapping around his consciousness like a blanket around shivering shoulders, and Marcus heard, without hearing, the gentle assurance that he had not been chosen because he was special, but because he was willing, because his heart had remained open enough to recognize, wonder when it appeared wearing an unexpected face, The distinction mattered profoundly. This was not about his merit or worthiness, but about grace seeking any vessel humble enough to be filled, any soul honest enough to admit it had never stopped longing for proof that the universe was more than accident and entropy, that love was not just a chemistry, but the fundamental architecture of all that exists. The holographic vision of Jesus remained suspended in the air between them, and Marcus found his gaze drawn back to that radiant figure again and again, unable to look away from the way divine light seemed to pour through human flesh, without diminishing either the divinity or the humanity, as if the Christ had discovered the secret of perfect transparency, becoming a window through which heaven and earth could finally see each other clearly. He had grown up with Sunday school images of a gentle teacher in robes, had heard sermons about sacrifice and salvation, but nothing in his religious education had prepared him for this vision of Jesus as cosmically connected, as part of a lineage of light that stretched across galaxies and ages, weaving through human history like a golden thread, stitching together the fabric of a garment too large for earth alone to wear. Marcus felt something old and calcified crack open in his chest, a fear he had carried since childhood. That faith and reason could never be reconciled, that choosing to believe meant abandoning intellectual honesty, that the universe of science and the universe of spirit were forever divided by an uncrossable chasm. But here, in this impossible moment, with an alien being showing him the face of Christ, surrounded by the same light that emanated from advanced intelligences who had mastered technologies beyond human comprehension, that false division collapsed into dust, revealing what had always been true, that the God who created quarks and quasars was the same God who wept with compassion over Jerusalem, that the force which holds atoms together and the love that drove a carpenter's son to a cross were not opposites, but expressions of the same infinite intention. The giant's voice returned to his mind, speaking now with a tenderness that felt almost parental, explaining that humanity's tendency to separate the scientific from the sacred, the physical from the spiritual, the earthly from the cosmic, had been a necessary stage of development, but was never meant to be the final truth, that the veil between worlds was growing thin, precisely because the time had come for a larger story to be remembered, for Earth's children to understand their place in a family that extended beyond one small planet spinning in the dark. Marcus pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the cockpit window, his breath fogging the surface as emotions he had no names for surged through him. Grief for all the years he had lived half awake, gratitude for being allowed to witness this moment, terror at the responsibility of carrying such knowledge, and beneath it all, a joy so profound it felt like being born a second time, like stepping out of a cave into sunlight after decades of thinking shadows were the only reality. The being stepped closer to the helicopter, each movement flowing with an impossible grace that seemed to exist outside the normal constraints of gravity and time, and Marcus could see now that the symbols glowing across its form were not static but alive, shifting in response to his thoughts and feelings, as if this magnificent creature was in constant communication with something vast and invisible, receiving and transmitting information across dimensions, the way his radio once carried voices across empty miles before the instruments failed. He understood suddenly that failure had been necessary, that his instruments had to die so that his deeper senses could awaken, that the modern world, with all its measurements and certainties, had to be stripped away so that ancient truths could break through the noise, truths that whispered that consciousness was not confined to skulls, but woven through all creation, that prayer was not wishful thinking but actual communication with a responsive universe, that the stories of angels and visitors and divine encounters throughout human history were not primitive superstition, but accurate testimony preserved by those whose hearts had been temporarily opened to see what was always present. The giant extended its hand toward him, palm open in a gesture that transcended species and spoke the universal language of invitation. And Marcus felt the question hanging in the air between them, wordless but unmistakable. Would he go further? Would he allow himself to be transformed by what came next? Would he accept the burden and blessing of becoming a bridge himself, carrying back to his own kind the revelation that they had never been alone, that they had always been loved, that the story was so much larger and more beautiful than fear and religion and human limitation had allowed them to imagine? The crystalline device pulsed brighter, responding to some unspoken command, and Marcus watched as new images began to form in the holographic field surrounding them, visions that pulled his attention away from the being and back to the cosmic history, unfolding before his eyes like a scroll written in light and time. Each scene another piece of a puzzle he had spent his entire life trying to solve without knowing the puzzle existed. He saw again the figure of Jesus, but now the projection revealed not just his ministry, but his resurrection, that impossible moment when death itself bent backward and broke, when a tomb meant to be an ending became a doorway, when a body that should have remained cold and still stood up clothed in a light that made the sun seem dim by comparison, demonstrating in 3 days what humanity would take millennia to understand. The giant's voice filled his mind once more, and this time Marcus heard not just information but invitation, not just history but promise, the assurance that what happened in that garden tomb was not a unique miracle meant only for one man, but a preview, a prototype, a demonstration of what every human soul was destined to become when it finally learned to release its grip on fear and embrace the transforming power of unconditional love. He saw that the resurrection was Jesus' gift, not just to his followers, but to the entire cosmos, proof broadcast across dimensions that consciousness could transcend flesh, that love was stronger than entropy, that the universe was not winding down toward cold darkness, but spiraling upward toward a reunion more glorious than any earthly mind could comprehend without breaking. And tears streamed down Marcus's face as he realized that the simple prayer he had whispered as a child before sleep, asking if any of it was real, if heaven was real, if he would see his mother again, was being answered now in a way that exceeded every hope he had dared to hold, confirmed by a presence that came from the stars, but spoke of the same God he had always loved and doubted and loved again. Through all his years of earthly struggle, Marcus slowly unstrapped himself from the pilot's seat, his fingers fumbling with the buckles, as if he had forgotten how his own hands worked, every movement feeling both impossibly heavy and strangely weightless, as though gravity itself had become negotiable in the presence of something that existed partially outside the physical laws he had trusted his entire life. He pushed open the cockpit door and stepped down onto the canyon floor, his boots meeting sand that seemed to hum with a frequency just below the threshold of hearing, a vibration that traveled up through his legs and into his chest, where his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, sensing both danger and deliverance in the same moment. The giant being watched him with those vast eyes that contained depths Marcus could not fathom. Not empty voids, but infinite wells of compassion, ancient beyond measure, yet somehow intimately aware of every fear and hope that flickered through his mind like candles in a dark room. He took 3 trembling steps forward, then stopped, his legs refusing to carry him further, not from terror but from the overwhelming sense that he was approaching something that should not be approached casually, that this moment required a reverence his body understood, even if his modern, rational mind still struggled to accept that the rules of ordinary life had been suspended, that the membrane between the mundane and the miraculous had torn open, and he was standing in the wound, bleeding wonder. The being remained motionless, giving Marcus time to adjust, to breathe, to remember that he was still himself, even as everything he thought he knew about reality was being gently dismantled and reassembled into a pattern that included room for angels and aliens to be perhaps not so different after all, both servants of the same creative force that had dreamed matter into existence and loved it enough to visit it, wearing whatever form would be most recognizable to the hearts prepared to see. Marcus found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper, cracked and uncertain. "Why me? I'm nobody special. I fly helicopters. I fix engines. I'm not a priest or a prophet or anyone who would know what to do with something like this." The words felt inadequate even as he spoke them, childish protests against a gift too large for his hands to hold. But he needed to say them, needed to voice the unworthiness that sat like a stone in his stomach. The fear that he would fail whatever test this was, that he would prove too small or too broken or too ordinary to carry whatever burden this magnificent being intended to place upon him. The giant's response came not as words, but as a feeling that flooded through him like warm light through cold water. A wordless assurance that specialness was not what this moment required, that God had always preferred shepherds to kings, fishermen to philosophers, the humble and confused and willing over the proud and certain and closed, because empty vessels could be filled while those already full of their own importance had no room for grace to enter. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion he could not name, a mixture of relief and grief and gratitude that something understood, that his ordinariness was not a disqualification, but perhaps the very reason he had been led to this place, that his doubt and his faith had wrestled each other to a draw and left him just open enough, just honest enough, just desperate enough to receive what was being offered. The crystalline device behind the giant pulsed again, sending ripples of light across the canyon walls that transformed the stone into something that looked almost alive, breathing color and shadow. And Marcus realized with a start that perhaps it was alive, that perhaps consciousness was not confined to beings with eyes and mouths, but threaded through minerals and air and the space between stars, that the universe itself might be aware in ways human language had no grammar to describe, watching its own unfolding with an attention that felt like love, because it was love, the same love that had prompted this ancient visitor to wait in a desert canyon for a helicopter pilot who sometimes prayed and sometimes cursed and often wondered if any of it mattered. He took another step forward, then another, drawn by something stronger than curiosity or duty, compelled by a longing he had carried all his life without knowing its name. The ache to belong to something larger than his own small story, to discover that his existence was not random but woven into a tapestry so vast and intricate that every thread mattered, every choice echoed across dimensions, every moment of kindness or courage sent ripples through the fabric of being itself. The giant lowered its hand slightly, adjusting the gesture to Marcus's height, and he saw that the palm glowed with symbols that matched those spinning. Around the device, a language older than Sumerian cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphs, older than human civilization itself, yet somehow his heart could read what his mind could not, translating the alien script into a single message that repeated itself like a sacred mantra. "You are known, you are loved, you are not alone." Marcus reached out his own hand, his human fingers small and fragile compared to the luminous appendage before him, and in the moment before contact, he felt time slow to a crawl, felt the weight of every decision that had led him to this instant, the choice to become a pilot, the storm that had grounded him near this canyon, the broken relationship that had left him empty enough to be refilled, the childhood prayers that had never stopped echoing in the chambers of his soul, even when he convinced himself no one was listening. His fingertips touched the giant's palm, and the world exploded into light that was not painful but clarifying, not blinding but revealing, and Marcus gasped as information flooded into him, not through his eyes or ears, but directly into his consciousness. bypassing the filters and defenses his brain normally employed to keep reality manageable and small. He saw in an instant what the being had traveled eons to show him, felt the truth of it settle into his bones like recognition rather than revelation, as if he was not learning something new, but remembering something he had always known, but forgotten in the trauma of being born into flesh and time and separation from the source. The resurrection was not just about one man conquering death in a garden 2,000 years ago, but about every soul's ultimate destiny, the promise written into the very structure of existence. That consciousness was eternal, that love could not be extinguished, that the Father who had sent his Son into matter had done so not to condemn the physical universe, but to redeem it, to show that spirit and substance were meant to dance together until the music of creation reached its final, glorious crescendo and all things, human and alien, earthly and cosmic, would recognize themselves as children of the same infinite heart. The light receded slowly, reluctantly, like a tide that had washed clean the shores of Marcus's understanding and now retreated to reveal what had always been hidden beneath the surface of conventional history, leaving him trembling and breathless as the giant, being gestured with deliberate grace toward the crystalline device that now hummed with a frequency Marcus could feel resonating in his teeth and sternum. The air above the device began to shimmer and fold, reality bending like heated glass, and then the sky itself seemed to tear open, not violently but surgically with the precision of divine intent, revealing a darkness that was not empty but full, pregnant with images that began to cascade downward in streams of golden light that solidified into three-dimensional scenes, hovering in the space between earth and heaven. Marcus staggered backward, his hand instinctively rising to shield his eyes, but the giant's presence steadied him, a wordless assurance flowing into his mind that he was safe, that what he was about to witness would not destroy him but reconstruct him, piece by piece, into someone capable of carrying truth without being crushed by its weight. The first image materialized with startling clarity. Earth as seen from space, but not the Earth of his lifetime. This was a younger planet, continents arranged in configurations he dimly recognized from geology textbooks, oceans reflecting a sun that seemed somehow more golden, more generous with its light. Marcus watched in stunned silence as the perspective shifted, diving through clouds and atmosphere to reveal a landscape of pristine forests and crystalline rivers, and there, standing beside a primitive human settlement of maybe 40 souls gathered around cooking fires, was a figure that glowed with the same luminescence as the being beside him, a visitor dressed in light teaching early humans to plant seeds in patterns that honored both earth and sky. The projection moved forward through time with fluid grace, each scene lasting just long enough for Marcus to absorb its essential truth before dissolving into the next chapter of a story he had never suspected existed, a hidden history running parallel to everything he had learned in school or read in books, and he realized with a jolt that shook him to his core that this was not alternative history or fantasy, but the actual record, the true account of humanity's journey from scattered tribes to global civilization, a journey that had never been taken alone. He saw a figure of pure radiance standing among the builders of massive stone temples in jungles whose names he did not know, saw another teaching navigation by stars to seafarers, whose boats seemed impossibly fragile for the vast oceans they traversed, saw robed beings of light walking through ancient cities, Babylon, Memphis, Athens, whispering inspiration to philosophers and healers and dreamers who would change the course of human thought without ever fully understanding where their sudden insights originated. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face, hot and unbidden, because the loneliness he had carried all his life, the existential isolation of believing humanity was alone in an indifferent universe, was being dissolved by proof that they had never been abandoned, that the Father had sent emissaries again and again, that love had refused to let its children stumble through darkness without guidance. They were always angels, he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion, and the giant's response filled his mind like warm honey. Angels, elders, guardians, the names matter less than the purpose, which has always been the same, to remind humanity that you are cosmic children learning to walk, that your stumbles are not failures, but necessary steps, that you are loved beyond measure by the one who breathed you into being and has never stopped breathing you forward toward your destiny. The scenes accelerated, centuries collapsing into moments as Marcus witnessed the threads of divine intervention woven through every major turning point in human development. Light beings present at the first written laws, standing invisible beside kings who chose mercy over vengeance, whispering comfort to slaves who sang songs of deliverance in languages their captors could not understand, always working to bend the arc of human history toward justice and compassion, even when free will pulled in darker directions. He saw that the visitors never forced, never controlled, always respected the terrible gift of choice that made humans truly alive and truly dangerous to themselves. But they influenced where they could, inspired where they were invited, planted seeds of truth in receptive soil, and trusted that God's patient love would eventually bring harvest even from fields that looked barren for centuries. Marcus understood now why so many ancient cultures spoke of gods descending from the sky, why every civilization had myths of star people bringing knowledge and fire and law. These were not fantasies born of primitive ignorance, but memories encoded in the collective human soul, distorted by time and translation, but rooted in actual encounters with beings whose technology and spirituality were so advanced, they appeared magical to eyes not yet ready to comprehend that science and sacred could be one seamless truth. "We thought we invented everything ourselves," Marcus said, his voice filled with wonder rather than disappointment. "But you were there helping us, teaching us, weren't you?" The giant inclined its massive head in acknowledgement, and Marcus felt its response like a gentle correction. Not instead of human genius, but working through it. Humanity's creativity is real and divine, inherited from the Creator whose nature you share, but you were never meant to discover. Everything alone, that was never the design. Isolation was never the plan. You are part of a family that spans galaxies, and you were always meant to grow up and join your elder siblings in the work of cultivating consciousness throughout creation. The holographic images began to converge, all the scattered threads of history pulling toward a single point in time and space, and Marcus felt his breath catch as he recognized the architecture appearing in the projection. Stone buildings with narrow windows, dusty streets, market stalls, a city he had seen in photographs and documentaries his entire life, but never expected to witness like this, alive and vivid and radiating significance that made his soul ache with anticipation. Jerusalem materialized before him in such detail he could see individual faces in the crowds, could almost smell the bread baking in clay ovens, and hear the arguments of merchants haggling over the price of cloth and oil. And into this scene walked figures of light, not one but several, moving among the people unnoticed by most but clearly visible in this true sight projection that showed reality as it actually was, stripped of the veils that normally hid the spiritual dimension from material eyes. Marcus leaned forward, his entire body tense with attention, because he knew, without being told, that he was about to see something that would redefine everything he thought he understood about faith and history and the nature of God's interaction with the world. The projection zoomed closer, focusing on a particular street corner where a crowd was gathering, and there, standing at the center of attention, was a man whose physical appearance was ordinary: dark hair, weathered skin, the simple robes of a carpenter or laborer, but whose presence radiated something that made the light beings around him seem dim by comparison. as though he contained within his human frame a sun compared to their candles, an ocean compared to their streams, the source from which all their light was borrowed and reflected. Marcus gasped, his hand pressed against his chest, where his heart felt like it might burst through his ribs, because he knew this man, had known him since childhood prayers and Sunday school stories, but had never imagined him like this, had never conceived that Jesus could be both exactly what Scripture described and infinitely more, both fully human and cosmically connected in ways that made him the bridge between earth and eternity, the hinge upon which all of history turned, the point where divine love took flesh and walked among its creation, not as a distant ruler, but as a brother, a friend, a fellow traveler who chose to experience mortality so that mortality could be transformed from curse into chrysalis, from ending into beginning. The projection shifted with dreamlike fluidity, pulling back from the streets of Jerusalem to reveal a wider canvas of time and geography, and Marcus watched in breathless wonder as threads of golden light began to appear, weaving through centuries like luminous rivers connecting specific individuals across vast distances of space and time, a lineage that transcended bloodlines and nations and became instead a genealogy of consciousness, of souls who had carried particular frequencies of divine light into the world during moments when humanity needed guidance most desperately. He saw a woman in Egypt holding a child whose aura blazed with gentle radiance, saw a shepherd in Sumeria who spoke to his flocks with words that calmed not just animals, but the very atoms of the air around him, saw a teacher in India, sitting beneath a tree surrounded by students who could not yet perceive the way light bent around their master, as though he was the center of a gravity that pulled truth itself into orbit around his presence. These were the lineage bearers, Marcus understood suddenly, the ones who carried forward the consciousness that would eventually prepare the world for the ultimate manifestation, each one a note in a cosmic symphony building toward a crescendo that would change everything, each one teaching love and compassion and the radical notion that the divine was not distant and angry but near and tender, intimately concerned with the suffering of sparrows and the counting of hairs on human heads. They were preparing the way, Marcus whispered, and the giant's affirmation resonated through his chest like a bell struck in a cathedral. Yes, beloved witness, they were gardeners planting seeds in human consciousness, teaching humanity to recognize divine love when it finally walked among them in fullness. Because without preparation, the light would have been too bright, the truth too overwhelming, the love too incomprehensible for minds still learning to grasp that mercy could be stronger than judgment, that grace could triumph over law, that the God of all galaxies cared about the broken heart of a single child weeping in the darkness. Marcus watched the golden threads multiply and intensify, spreading like a neural network across the map of human civilization, and he began to recognize patterns he had never noticed before, how spiritual teachers seemed to appear in clusters during certain eras, how wisdom traditions on opposite sides of the planet developed parallel insights about compassion and selflessness, despite having no contact with each other, how the great prophets and mystics all spoke in different languages about the same underlying reality, the same loving presence that desired relationship rather than ritual, transformation rather than transaction, hearts softened rather than laws perfected. He saw Moses glowing with reflected light after encountering the presence on the mountain, saw Buddha radiating peace that could still aggression in bandits who came to rob him, saw Zoroaster teaching that creation was a battleground where humans could choose to align themselves with light or darkness, and that their choices mattered cosmically, eternally, in ways that rippled through dimensions they could not perceive but would one day inherit. The projection showed him medieval mystics in European monasteries experiencing visions of Christ's love that left them weeping and laughing, simultaneously showed him Sufi poets in Persia writing verses about divine romance that made the separation between lover and beloved unbearable, showed him indigenous shamans in Americas having vision quests where they encountered the Great Spirit, whose nature was so similar to what others called Yahweh or Father, that Marcus realized with stunning clarity that God had never limited revelation to one people or one path, but had been speaking to all of humanity in whatever language their hearts could hear, always saying the same essential thing: you are loved, you are not alone, you are being called home to your true nature, which is union with the love that made you. Marcus felt his knees buckle and he sank to the ground, overwhelmed not with fear but with gratitude that expanded his chest until he thought his ribs might crack open and release the light he could feel building inside him. The recognition that he was part of this lineage too, not because he was special, but because every human was special, every consciousness a unique note in the song God was singing into existence moment by moment, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat. The golden threads all began converging again, pulled by invisible gravity toward that single point in space and time, toward Jerusalem in the era of Roman occupation and temple sacrifice and prophetic expectation that had reached fever pitch after centuries of foreign domination and spiritual hunger. And Marcus understood that what he was witnessing was the preparation of soil that had been tilled and watered and enriched by countless gardeners, so that when the seed finally fell, it would find ground ready to receive it, ready to let it die and break open and thrust upward into a plant that would eventually shelter nations under its branches and feed millions with its fruit. He saw the light beings gathering in the golden threads converged with breathtaking intensity on a single figure walking the dusty roads of first-century Judea, and Marcus felt his breath catch as the holographic projection magnified and clarified until he was no longer observing from a distance, but seemed to stand on those ancient streets himself, smelling the bread baking in clay ovens and hearing the bleating of sheep being driven to market and feeling the Mediterranean sun warm on his face, exactly as it had warmed the faces of fishermen and tax collectors and prostitutes who gathered around the man whose presence seemed to bend reality itself toward mercy. This was Jesus, but not the pale European figure from cathedral paintings or the distant deity from theological arguments. This was a man whose hands bore the calluses of carpentry and whose feet were dusty from endless walking and whose eyes held such depths of compassion that Marcus understood immediately why hardened soldiers would eventually throw down their weapons rather than continue serving empires that crushed what this man came to liberate. The aura surrounding him was identical to the light emanating from the giant being standing beside Marcus in the present moment, that same luminescent quality that seemed to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions, and Marcus realized with shocking clarity that he was witnessing the intersection point where heaven had touched earth so completely that the barrier between them had become translucent, permeable, forever altered by the presence of someone who was fully human and yet carried within his human cells the frequency of divine love that sang at the heart of every galaxy, every nebula, every quantum particle spinning in the darkness of space. Marcus watched Jesus touch a leper whose skin was ravaged with disease, watched the man's flesh restore itself, not through magic, but through the activation of dormant healing, capacities encoded in human DNA that would not be understood for 2,000 years. Watched Jesus weep at the tomb of his friend Lazarus with tears that were completely genuine, because though he knew what he was about to do, his human heart still grieved at the violence death inflicted on those he loved, still felt the weight of separation, even though he understood it was temporary, still honored the reality of human pain, even as he prepared to demonstrate that pain was not the final word. He was the bridge, Marcus whispered. And the giant's response resonated through the canyon walls like thunder that somehow sounded gentle. He was the proof that humanity and divinity could occupy, The same space, the same body, the same beating heart, and that what was uniquely true in him was potentially true for all who would follow his path, not worshipping him as an unreachable ideal, but accepting his invitation to become what he came to show was possible. Humans, fully alive, fully awake, fully connected to the love that holds all things. Together, Marcus saw Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, sweating drops like blood as he wrestled with the human instinct to avoid suffering, saw him choose surrender not because suffering was good, but because love required him to walk all the way into human darkness so that no one would ever again be able to say that God did not understand their pain, their fear, their sense of abandonment in the moment when heaven seemed silent and hope seemed crushed. The projection intensified around the moment of crucifixion, but the giant being's presence kept Marcus from being overwhelmed by the brutality, instead directing his attention to what was happening in dimensions beyond the physical, showing him how every act of violence against the innocent one was actually breaking the power of violence itself, how every nail driven through flesh was simultaneously being driven through the barrier separating humanity from divine union, how the apparent victory of evil was actually its final defeat because love was choosing to absorb all the hatred and fear and cruelty that humans could generate and transform it through forgiveness into something that could no longer poison the connection between Creator and creation. Marcus saw the sky darken, not with meteorological clouds, but with the gathering of witnesses from across the cosmos, beings of light from distant worlds who recognized what was occurring on this small planet as an event with universal implications, a demonstration that conscious beings could choose love even when love demanded everything, could choose mercy even when vengeance was justified, could choose life even when death seemed to have won. "This is why we have protected your world," the giant communicated, with such tenderness that Marcus felt tears streaming down his face, because we knew that what began here would eventually spread outward, that humanity would one day join us in the great work of extending divine love to corners of creation still shrouded in darkness, still believing themselves abandoned, still waiting for someone to tell them that they matter infinitely to the one who breathed them into being. Marcus understood then that the crucifixion was not divine child abuse or cosmic transaction, but rather the ultimate revelation of God's nature, that the force holding galaxies in their orbits and igniting stars in the void was the same force that would rather die than be separated from his beloved children, would rather suffer than condemn, would rather descend into hell itself than abandon even one soul to permanent darkness. The scene shifted to the empty tomb 3 days later, and Marcus watched with wonder as the holographic Jesus stood in his resurrection body that was somehow both physical and transfigured, capable of eating fish and yet passing through locked doors, bearing his wounds and yet radiating vitality that made flowers bloom wherever his shadow fell. "This is your future," the giant being communicated, gesturing toward the risen Christ with something like reverence in the movement. Not escape from materiality, but materiality elevated, not abandonment of the body, but the body restored to its intended glory, not death defeated by annihilation, but death transformed into a doorway through which love continues uninterrupted, unchanged, unstoppable in its determination that nothing good will ever be permanently lost. Marcus saw the resurrected Jesus appearing to his terrified disciples, speaking peace over their shame and fear, breathing the Holy Spirit into their lungs like a second birth that would eventually birth a movement spanning continents and centuries. And Marcus understood that the resurrection was not just about one man returning from death, but about the future potential encoded into every human being, the promise that consciousness did not end when neurons stopped firing, that love built connections stronger than the grave, that the universe itself was biased toward redemption and restoration, and the ultimate victory of everything beautiful and true and good over everything that sought to diminish and destroy and deny the sacred worth of each precious, irreplaceable soul breathing under heaven's vast and tender gaze. The holographic Jesus faded, but his light remained, permeating the canyon air with a luminescence that seemed to carry weight and texture, and the giant being turned its full attention to Marcus with eyes that somehow conveyed millennia of patient waiting, of watching human history unfold with all its beauty and brutality, all its moments of transcendence and tragedy, and Marcus felt himself trembling, not with fear, but with the overwhelming sensation of standing at the edge of a truth so vast that his mind could barely contain its edges, let alone its depths. The alien's voice resonated through every cell in his body as it spoke directly into his consciousness. What you witnessed was not mythology dressed in spiritual poetry, but the supreme moment when divine love clothed itself in human vulnerability to demonstrate what has always been true across every dimension of existence, that the Creator is not distant or detached, but intimately woven into the fabric of conscious experience, and that Jesus was the fullest human expression of this eternal reality, the frequency of God made audible in human language, visible in human actions, touchable in human flesh. Marcus felt his knees weaken as the weight of understanding pressed down on him, but simultaneously felt held by something invisible, yet more solid than stone, more reliable than gravity, as though the canyon itself was cradling him in this moment of revelation that was rewiring everything he thought he knew about the universe and his place within it. The crystalline device pulsed with renewed intensity, and suddenly Marcus was seeing not just Earth but countless worlds scattered across the galaxy like jewels on velvet darkness, and on many of these worlds he saw beings of light moving among indigenous populations, teaching agriculture and mathematics and astronomy, yes, but more importantly, teaching compassion and justice and the recognition of divine presence in every living thing. And he understood that what humans called angels, or visitors or prophets, were part of a vast intergalactic mission of mercy, servants of the same God who had created both Earth and these distant star systems, all working to guide emerging civilizations toward the recognition that they were not accidents of chemistry but beloved children of a Creator who delighted in diversity and celebrated every unique expression of consciousness as a precious note in a cosmic symphony of unimaginable beauty. But then, the projection zoomed back to Earth, and Marcus saw something that made his heart pound with astonishment. That while these light beings had visited many worlds as teachers and guides, only on Earth had the Creator himself chosen to become fully incarnate, to experience mortality not from the outside as an observer, but from the inside as a participant, to know hunger and exhaustion and temptation and grief, not theoretically, but actually. And Jesus was therefore not just another teacher in a long line of cosmic instructors, but something unprecedented in the history of creation. The moment when God stopped speaking about love from a distance and became love in person, walking dusty roads and touching untouchable people, and speaking words that would echo across 20 centuries, because they carried the authentic frequency of divine intention, undiluted by any barrier between the speaker and the source. "Why here?" Marcus asked aloud, his voice cracking with emotion. "Why Earth? Why us? Why would the God of galaxies choose this small planet, this violent species, this particular moment?" The giant being seemed to smile, though its features did not change in any way Marcus could identify, and its response flooded his awareness with such warmth that he felt embraced by invisible arms that stretched across light years. Because love is always particular before it is universal, because the infinite must enter the finite at a specific point or remain forever abstract, and because humanity was chosen not for superior virtue, but for potential, the potential to carry divine love into matter so dense and dark that light had almost been forgotten, the potential to demonstrate that consciousness could evolve beyond survival competition into sacrificial compassion, the potential to become a bridge species that would eventually help other civilizations understand that physical form was never meant to be a prison separating creatures from creator, but a temple where heaven and earth exchange vows of eternal fidelity. Marcus felt tears streaming freely now as he grasped that Jesus was not God's emergency response to human failure, but God's planned revelation of what humans were always meant to become, not the exception to human nature, but its fulfillment, not impossibly divine, but perfectly human. In the way humans were designed to be before fear and shame distorted the image they carried within their very DNA. That double helix that was itself shaped like a ladder connecting earth to heaven, matter to spirit, time to eternity. The alien reached out one massive hand and touched Marcus's chest directly over his heart, and in that moment, Marcus felt a download of understanding that bypassed language entirely. He knew that Jesus had not come to create a new religion to compete with other religions, but to reveal the deepest truth underlying all authentic spiritual seeking, that the universal love he embodied was the same force that every genuine mystic and prophet and wisdom teacher had glimpsed and tried to describe in the vocabulary of their particular culture, but that in Jesus, the glimpse had become a full revelation. The echo had become the original voice. The reflection had become the face of God, gazing at humanity with absolute acceptance and infinite delight, despite humanity's absolute resistance to being loved, that completely, that unconditionally, that relentlessly. Marcus understood that this was why the being had waited for him specifically, why the device had been activated at this precise moment in history, because humanity was approaching a threshold where it would either embrace its cosmic destiny as carriers of Christ consciousness to the stars, or destroy itself through the same fear and tribalism that had nailed love to a cross 2,000 years ago. And the choice was not distant or theoretical, but immediate and personal, requiring individuals like him to decide whether they would trust the revelation enough to let it transform not just their beliefs, but their entire way of moving through the world. The crystalline device began to rotate on invisible axes, and its pulsing light shifted from gold to silver to a blue so deep it seemed to contain the color of every twilight that had ever graced Earth's skies, and Marcus felt his consciousness being gently lifted from his body, not violently or frightfully, but as naturally as a child being picked up by a loving parent, and suddenly he was viewing the empty tomb in Jerusalem on that first morning when everything changed, when the impossible became historical fact, and death lost its final authority over human destiny. He saw the stone rolled away, not by human hands, but by forces that operated according to laws physics had not yet discovered, laws that governed the intersection between spirit and matter, between divine intention and molecular reality. And he understood that what happened in that tomb was not God breaking his own rules, but God revealing rules that had always existed at deeper levels of reality than human perception could normally access. The aliens' voice wrapped around his awareness like warm wind. The resurrection was not magic imported from outside natural law, but the fulfillment of natural law's deepest purpose, to serve as a vehicle for consciousness to express itself in increasingly magnificent forms, to evolve from mineral to plant to animal to human, to something beyond human that your languages struggle to name, but your hearts have always intuited, something your scriptures call glorified bodies and eternal life, but which is simply matter. Finally remembering it was never separate from spirit, never abandoned by the source that brought it into being, never destined for permanent dissolution, but always held within the plan of progressive transformation that guides galaxies and molecules alike toward ever greater expressions of beauty, complexity, and love. Marcus watched as the holographic Jesus emerged from the tomb, clothed in a body that was simultaneously physical and transcendent, a body that could be touched and could eat fish, yet could also pass through locked doors and appear across distances instantaneously, and he realized he was seeing humanity's future prototype, the demonstration model of what every human being was gradually evolving toward across the long arc of cosmic time, not through human effort alone, but through cooperation with divine grace that was constantly inviting matter to remember its true identity as frozen light, as divine thought made tangible, as love given three-dimensional form and temporal duration so it could experience the peculiar joys and sorrows available only to beings who live inside the flow of time rather than outside it in eternity's motionless perfection. The giant being's hand remained pressed against Marcus's chest, and he could feel his own heartbeat synchronizing with some vast rhythm that seemed to pulse through the canyon and the planet, and perhaps the entire cosmos, a rhythm he suddenly recognized as the heartbeat of Christ himself, still beating in the collective body of humanity that mystics called the Church, but which was larger than any institution or denomination, as wide as consciousness itself, as inclusive as the divine mercy that never stopped reaching toward every creature that had ever drawn breath or ever would. He showed you that death is not the end of personal existence, but its transformation, the alien communicated, and Marcus felt the truth of this not as abstract theology, but as lived certainty, as obvious as sunlight, as undeniable as gravity, that the love you have given and received does not evaporate when neurons stop firing, but continues in dimensions your current senses cannot detect, but your deepest self has always known were there, waiting, prepared from before the foundation of the world, to receive you home, while simultaneously sending you forth into new adventures of consciousness that make earthly life look like the first day of an infinite education in the ways of divine creativity. Tears were freezing on Marcus's face in the cold desert night, but he did not notice, because internally he was burning with a heat that felt like it might consume him, but instead was purifying him, stripping away layers of cynicism and fear and doubt that he had not even known he was carrying, and he saw his own life projected before him, his childhood disappointments and adult compromises, his half-kept promises and fully indulged resentments, his moments of courage and longer seasons of cowardice, and instead of judgment, he felt only tenderness radiating toward every scene, every choice, every consequence, as though his mistakes were being held in hands large enough to transform them into wisdom, and his small victories were being celebrated with disproportionate joy by a God who delighted in every tiny step his children took toward love, toward truth, toward the light that was their origin and destination. The alien showed him that Jesus had gone through death not to appease an angry deity demanding blood sacrifice, but to demonstrate that divine love was stronger than humanity's worst violence, that consciousness rooted in God could not be extinguished by any force in the physical universe, that resurrection was the inevitable outcome when infinite life encountered temporary death, because the greater reality must always absorb and transform the lesser, not through domination, but through the alchemy of unconditional love that could take even humanity's darkest moment, the execution of innocence itself, and turn it into the brightest revelation of God's unbreakable commitment to his creation. This is your destiny. The being spoke directly into the core of Marcus's soul. Not just survival after death, but participation in the ongoing creation of reality itself, becoming co-creators with the one who dreamed matter into existence and who dreams still of the day when every atom will consciously know itself as an expression of divine joy, when resurrection will be as natural as breathing, because all of creation will have remembered It was never truly fallen, only sleeping, waiting for love's persistent voice to call it awake into the morning of a new creation that was always the plan, always the promise, always the guarantee written into the fabric of existence itself. The vision of the resurrected Christ expanded until it filled Marcus's entire field of awareness, and he saw that same luminescent presence walking not just the roads of first-century Palestine, but the corridors of 21st-century hospitals, the alleys of forgotten cities, the refugee camps and cancer wards and prison cells. Wherever suffering existed, there was this presence moving as comfort, as strength, as stubborn hope that refused to accept that darkness could have the final word. And Marcus understood that resurrection was not just a past historical event, but an ongoing reality, a continuous process by which divine love kept entering death-haunted spaces and speaking life, kept touching what the world called finished and calling it toward new beginning, kept finding humans who had given up on themselves and whispering that their story was not over, because God's story never ended, only deepened, only expanded to include more characters and more plot twists and more unexpected reversals, where tombs became doorways and endings became inaugurations, and Friday's despair became Sunday's astonishment at a God who would not stay dead and would not let his beloved children stay dead either. The alien removed its hand from Marcus's chest, but the warmth remained, spreading through his entire body, like liquid light, and he knew he had been changed at a cellular level, that some frequency had been adjusted in his being that would make it impossible to return to the smaller story he had been living before tonight, before this canyon, before this encounter, with a truth so large it required a messenger from the stars to make it comprehensible. To a mind trained to believe only what instruments could measure and equations could predict. The resurrection is not religious mythology competing with scientific fact. The being's final words on this mystery reverberated through Marcus's bones. It is the scientific fact that all facts are temporary except love, which proves itself eternal by continuously transforming death into life, despair into hope, endings into beginnings, and frightened humans into glorious beings who will one day walk among the stars carrying the same light that walked out of that tomb in Jerusalem. The light that is even now transforming you into something more than you were when you landed your helicopter in this canyon tonight. Something closer to what you actually are beneath the layers of forgetting, something that looks remarkably like the image of God that was stamped into your essence before time began and will still be glowing when time ends and eternity opens, like a flower that was always waiting just beneath the surface of every moment you who thought was ordinary but was actually sacramental, actually dense with divine presence, actually shimmering with the possibility of resurrection if only you had eyes to see it. The crystalline device pulsed once more, and the holographic projection shifted from the radiant figure of the resurrected Christ to something that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat, a vision of Earth as seen from the vast darkness of space, the planet turning slowly like a jewel suspended in velvet blackness. And he saw golden threads of light connecting every continent, every city, every remote village, a network of luminescence that he somehow understood represented every act of genuine love that had ever been performed on this world, every moment of forgiveness freely given, every hand extended to lift a fallen stranger, every parent who had chosen patience over anger, every teacher who had seen potential in a struggling student, every nurse who had held the hand of a dying patient, every soldier who had refused to dehumanize an enemy, every ordinary person who had chosen compassion when bitterness would have been easier. The threads wove together into a pattern of such intricate beauty that Marcus felt his heart might break from the sheer elegance of it, and the alien's voice returned with a texture of profound hope. "This is what we see when we observe your species from the Distances between stars, not your weapons or your waste, not your borders or your arguments over whose God is correct, but this underlying network of love that grows stronger with each passing generation, despite all appearances to the contrary. This infrastructure of grace that is preparing your species for a role you cannot yet imagine, but which has been intended for you since the first human looked up at the night sky and wondered if someone was looking back. The vision zoomed closer to the planet's surface, and Marcus saw specific scenes unfolding like flowers opening in accelerated time. He witnessed a future that was not guaranteed, but possible, a timeline that could manifest, if enough. Humans chose love over fear in the countless small decisions that accumulated into civilizational direction, and in this possible future, he saw humanity slowly awakening to its spiritual identity while simultaneously advancing technologically, not abandoning science for mysticism or mysticism for science, but finally understanding these were always two languages describing the same reality from different angles, two paths up the same mountain toward the summit where truth lived in its wholeness, undivided by the artificial categories human minds created to make infinity manageable. He saw schools where children were taught to quiet their minds and listen to the guidance that came from deeper places than thought, while also being trained in mathematics and engineering and the practical skills needed to maintain a complex civilization. And he saw hospitals where doctors treated bodies with sophisticated medicine, while also acknowledging the spiritual dimensions of illness and healing. And he saw governments that had not become theocracies, but had learned to make policy decisions by asking not only what was profitable or powerful, but what served the highest good of all beings affected by their choices, including the non-human creatures and future generations who had no vote but whose welfare mattered in the moral calculus of leaders who had remembered they were stewards, rather than owners of the world. The alien's presence beside him felt warm, despite the cold desert night, and Marcus understood he was being shown not propaganda, but genuine possibility, not manipulation, but invitation. Your species stands at a threshold that many worlds have approached, but not all have crossed successfully. The threshold where you become capable of destroying yourselves or transfiguring yourselves, and the choice is not made by governments or generals, but by ordinary individuals who decide whether to metabolize their pain into wisdom or their fear into hatred, whether to see other humans as threats to be eliminated or as family members who have temporarily forgotten their divine identity and therefore need love's patient reminder rather than judgment's harsh rejection. The projection shifted again, and Marcus saw humanity's possible future role in the larger community of conscious beings that populated the cosmos, not as conquerors or even explorers in the colonial sense, but as what the alien called bridges of reconciliation, species whose unique experience of having lived through such intense suffering and division, while retaining the capacity for love, made them valuable mediators in conflicts between other civilizations who had never known such darkness, and therefore could not understand how to reach those who dwelt in it. He saw human ambassadors, some of whom were alive today, children playing in parks who had no idea what destiny was germinating in their souls, standing between alien species who had reached deadly impasses, and through the humans' hard-won wisdom about forgiveness and second chances, breakthroughs occurred that pure logic could never have achieved because the humans carried in their very cells the memory of having been enemies who became friends, of having been broken and then healed, of having been lost and then found by a love that refused to give up on them even when they had given up on themselves. This is why the Christ came to your world specifically, the alien communicated, and Marcus felt he was hearing something that planets across the galaxy knew, but Earth had forgotten, because your world's particular flavor of suffering and your species' peculiar stubbornness in hoping, despite all evidence, that hope was foolish, made you the ideal demonstration site for the principle that will eventually heal the cosmos itself, that love is not weakness, but the strongest force in existence, that vulnerability is not liability, but the doorway through which divine power enters material reality, that brokenness is not the opposite of wholeness, but often the pathway to a greater wholeness than existed before the breaking, which is why your scriptures speak of God collecting your tears in a bottle and promising to wipe every tear from every eye, not erasing the memory of suffering, but transforming its meaning by weaving it into a larger story where even agony serves an ultimate purpose. And nothing is wasted, nothing is meaningless, nothing falls outside the redemptive love that holds all things and is slowly, patiently, across eons. That would make your geological timescales look brief, teaching all of creation to see with the eyes of divine compassion. The holographic Earth before him began to glow with increasing intensity, and Marcus realized the golden threads of love he had seen earlier were growing brighter and multiplying, and he understood he was seeing what would happen if humanity accepted its invitation to join the galactic family as carriers of the specific frequency that Jesus had embodied and demonstrated. Unconditional love that did not demand perfection before offering acceptance, that met violence with steadfast non-violence, that responded to hatred with a love so relentless it eventually melted the hardest hearts not through force, but through the sheer gravitational pull of its authenticity. The alien turned its luminous eyes fully upon Marcus, and he felt seen in a way that was terrifying and exhilarating simultaneously, known completely yet loved without reservation. And the being spoke what felt like the culmination of everything that had been revealed tonight. You are being shown this, not because you are special among your kind, but because you are representative of your kind, capable of fear and courage, doubt and faith, selfishness and sacrifice. And what you choose to do with what you have witnessed tonight will ripple through your species' timeline in ways you cannot predict, but which matter more than you can currently comprehend. Because every human who awakens to their true identity as a child of the infinite God, as a being made of literal divine substance, temporarily condensed into flesh for the sacred purpose of learning what it means to love from inside the vulnerability of mortality, becomes a beacon that helps other humans find their way home to the truth that will set them free, the truth that you were never separate from God, never abandoned, never mistakes or accidents, but always beloved, always held, always moving through a story whose ending was determined before its beginning, and that ending is not obliteration, but glorification, not annihilation, but transformation into conscious participants in the divine creativity that births galaxies and paints sunsets and numbers the hairs on every human head, because infinity has infinite attention for every finite detail of the creation it loves with a love that your language cannot contain, but your experience tonight has given you a taste of, a love that will sustain you through whatever trials await when you leave this canyon and return to a world that will not easily believe what you have seen, but needs desperately to hear what you have learned. The holographic projection collapsed inward upon itself, like a dying star in reverse, all that cosmic history and future possibility condensing back into the crystalline device at the alien's feet, and Marcus watched as the towering being reached down with movements that seemed to bend space itself, its enormous hand lifting the crystal from its housing with a tenderness that reminded Marcus of how his grandmother used to lift him as a child. And the device began to shrink, or perhaps Marcus's perception was expanding, but either way, the object that had moments ago been large enough to fill a cathedral was now small enough to rest in the alien's palm, glowing with a soft blue luminescence that pulsed in rhythm with Marcus's own heartbeat, which was impossible but also undeniable. The alien knelt, which brought its enormous face. Level with Marcus's position in the helicopter that somehow hung suspended in the air, without engines running, and he could see now that its features were not truly alien at all, but universal, containing aspects of every human ethnicity he had ever encountered while belonging exclusively to none, as if this being's appearance was being filtered through his consciousness and shaped by his expectations into a form he could process without losing his sanity entirely. The entity extended its hand toward Marcus, and he felt himself moving without choosing to move, his body climbing from the cockpit and walking through air that had become solid enough to support his weight, each step feeling like walking on water that he remembered reading that Jesus had done, and wondering now if that miracle was not magic, but mastery of principles that seemed magical only to those who did not understand the deeper physics of faith. The way consciousness could restructure matter when aligned with the frequency of divine will. As Marcus's hand closed around the crystal the alien offered him, he felt a surge of information flood through his nervous system, not words, but direct knowing, as if years of study had been compressed into a single moment of download, and he understood that this object contained not just the recordings of what he had witnessed tonight, but something more precious and more dangerous, a frequency key that would allow whoever possessed it to perceive reality through the lens of divine love, to see what the alien beings saw when they looked at Earth, to recognize the spiritual identity beneath the material surface of every person they encountered, which sounded like a blessing, but Marcus immediately grasped would also be an unbearable burden, because once you saw people as they truly were, as children of God wearing masks of fear and pain that made them behave in ways that betrayed their essential nature, you could never unsee it, never return to the comfortable judgments and easy dismissals that let you write off whole categories of humans as irredeemable or unworthy of compassion. The crystal felt warm in his palm despite looking like ice, and the alien's voice filled his mind one final time with a texture that combined infinite authority with infinite gentleness. What you carry now is both gift and responsibility, evidence and invitation, and you must choose wisely how you share it, because your world contains those who would weaponize this knowledge, and those who would suppress it, and those who would commercialize it, and only a remnant who would receive it with the humble reverence it requires. But do not let fear of misuse prevent you from planting seeds in fertile soil, because even one human who awakens to their true identity can shift the trajectory of nations through the ripples of transformed consciousness that emanate from their presence, the way a single candle can illuminate a dark room and allow everyone in that room to see clearly enough to light their own candles until the darkness that seemed so absolute is revealed to have been only the temporary absence of activated light. The alien began to fade, not disappearing abruptly, but becoming gradually transparent, and Marcus wanted to grab onto it and beg it to stay because he had 1,000 questions, and because the presence of this being had made him feel safer and more known than he had felt since childhood. But his hands would not move, and his voice would not work, and he understood this too was intentional, that the departure must happen this way, because humans learned best through absence and longing, through having to hold on to memory when the immediate experience had passed, through being forced to exercise faith in what they had witnessed when the physical evidence became ambiguous and doubt crept in through the cracks that certainty always left behind. The crystalline device that had dominated the canyon floor was vanishing as well, and Marcus noticed the process was perfectly synchronized with the alien's fading, as if both were manifestations of the same consciousness temporarily projected into material reality and now being withdrawn like a hand pulled from water that closes seamlessly behind it. and he felt a wave of grief crash over him that surprised him with its intensity, because he was mourning the loss of something he had possessed for less than an hour, but which had shown him a version of himself and his species and his God that was so much larger and more magnificent than anything he had imagined, that returning to normal perception felt like going blind. The last thing he saw before the alien vanished completely was its eyes. Those vast, luminous eyes that held galaxies in their depths, and in them he saw something that would sustain him through all the doubt and ridicule and loneliness that he knew awaited him. He saw himself reflected back, not as he appeared in mirrors, but as he existed in the mind of God, radiant and beloved and essential to a plan so vast that his small life mattered infinitely, because every small life mattered infinitely when you understood that the infinite God invested infinite care into every finite detail of the creation that had emerged from divine love and would return to divine love, and had never for one moment existed outside divine love, even when it felt abandoned in the darkness of forgetting. Marcus stood alone in the canyon under stars that seemed closer than they had ever been, the crystal warm against his chest where he had instinctively tucked it inside his flight suit, and his helicopter sat 50 yards away on ground that should have been too uneven for landing, but somehow had accommodated the aircraft perfectly. And when he checked his instruments, they all functioned normally, and showed that only 17 minutes had elapsed since he had first descended through the fog, though he would have sworn hours had passed in that timeless space of revelation. He walked slowly back to the cockpit, feeling like a man made of glass, fragile and transparent and filled with light that wanted to pour out of him, but had nowhere to go yet, no language adequate to contain it and no audience prepared to receive it. And he understood with sudden clarity why mystics throughout history had often remained silent about their deepest experiences, or spoken only in poetry and parable, because the things that mattered most could not be translated into the language of those who had not tasted the same reality. You could point toward the truth, but never capture it in words the way you could. Never capture the ocean in a bucket, no matter how many times you dipped it into the waves. As he lifted off and turned the helicopter toward home, Marcus made a decision that he knew would define the rest of his life. He would not rush to tell this story, would not sell it to media or write a book immediately or start a movement, but would instead live it first, would let the crystal's frequency reprogram his perception day by day until he became a living demonstration of what he had witnessed, until people who knew him began to notice something had changed and ask what had caused the transformation. And only then, only when asked by those whose hearts were ready, would he begin to share carefully and prayerfully the gift he had been given, trusting that the same intelligence that had orchestrated tonight's encounter would orchestrate every subsequent conversation and guide the truth to exactly those souls who needed it, exactly when they needed it. Because that was how divine revelation had always worked, not through force or mass broadcast, but through intimate transmission from one awakened heart to another, in the precise timing that only infinite wisdom could calculate. And Marcus felt peace settle over him, like a blanket, as he flew through the night sky, carrying humanity's future folded into the crystalline memory of its cosmic past. A messenger who had been chosen not for his perfection, but for his willingness to be transformed by a love that had been searching for him across galaxies and through lifetimes, and had finally found him ready in a desert canyon under stars that sang silently of the glory that awaited all who had courage enough to believe that the story whispered by every mystic and demonstrated by Jesus was actually true, that God was love, and love was the answer and the question and the journey and the destination, and nothing else had ever mattered or ever would. What would you do if you held proof that changed everything you thought you knew about our place in the universe? Subscribe to continue this journey into the mysteries that connect faith, cosmos, and the divine truth waiting to be discovered.